The sun was barely rising over the small town of Dustwood, painting the horizon in shades of orange and gold. For Clara Mayfield, mornings had become the hardest part of the day. She would wake up in the tiny attic room she rented above the general store, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how much longer she could keep going. Life had never been gentle with her. Her father had passed away when she was just 16. Her mother remarried and moved on, and Clara was left with nothing but a pair of calloused hands and a determination to survive. Work was scarce, and Clara had tried everything: mending clothes, scrubbing floors, waiting tables at the saloon. But the money was never enough. She wanted stability, something that would pay her bills and give her a chance at dignity. More than that, she wanted a place to belong. It was Mrs. Langley, the owner of the general store, who first mentioned the opportunity. "They're looking for a cook up at the Miller Ranch," the older woman said one morning as Clara delivered laundry. "It's a rough place, full of cowboys and long days, but the pay is steady. You'd have a roof over your head and 3 meals for yourself, too." At first, Clara hesitated. She had never worked on a ranch before, let alone cooked for a dozen hungry men. The idea of being surrounded by strangers in such a wild, masculine world made her nervous. But what choice did she really have? She folded her hands in her lap that night and prayed quietly, asking for courage. By morning, she had made up her mind. With her few belongings packed in a carpet bag and her best dress ironed neatly, Clara boarded the wagon that would take her out to the ranch. The road stretched endlessly across the open plains, dust rising behind the wheels as the horses trotted forward. She watched the land roll by, tall grass waving in the wind, cattle grazing in the distance, and the mountains looming like silent guardians on the horizon. Her heart pounded as the ranch finally came into view. It was larger than anything she'd ever seen. A wide yard filled with corrals, barns, and bunkhouses. Cowboys on horseback rode past with lariats swinging, calling to one another in rough voices. The smell of leather, hay, and sweat filled the air. Clara gripped her bag tighter, her palms damp. The foreman, a burly man named Hank, greeted her with a skeptical look. "So you're the new cook," he said, scratching his beard. "Hope you can handle feeding hungry men. They're not easy to please." Clara forced a small smile. "I'll do my best, sir." As she stepped inside the ranch kitchen, a long room with a heavy iron stove, shelves of tin plates, and sacks of flour stacked in the corner, Clara felt a mix of fear and determination. This was her chance, her fresh start. She didn't know it yet, but among the cowboys she was about to cook for, one of them owned every acre of land beneath her feet. Clara's first morning at the Miller Ranch began before sunrise. The foreman, Hank, had made it clear. Cowboys wanted hot coffee and biscuits on the table by the time they came in from the barns. She rose in the dim gray light, tied her hair back with a ribbon, and buttoned her plain calico dress, determined to prove herself. The ranch kitchen was colder than she expected, the stone floor sending a chill through her thin shoes. She stoked the stove until flames roared, then set to work, measuring flour, kneading dough, and frying bacon in cast iron pans. The smell soon drifted outside, mingling with the crisp dawn air. By the time the cowboys filed in, Clara's nerves were a storm inside her chest. There were more of them than she expected, at least a dozen, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their boots muddy from morning chores. They clattered in with loud voices, laughter, and the kind of rough energy that made her feel out of place. "Morning, boys," Hank said, waving them toward the long wooden table. "This here's Clara, your new cook. Treat her fair, or you'll answer to me." Clara gave a timid nod as the men tipped their hats or muttered greetings. They wasted no time digging into the food. She braced herself for complaints. But soon, the table quieted to the sound of biscuits being torn apart and coffee mugs being drained. One cowboy chuckled. "Well, Hank, looks like you finally found us someone who can cook," he said with a grin, slapping his neighbor on the back. Relief washed over Clara. For the first time in weeks, she felt she might be standing on solid ground. Still, she noticed not all the cowboys were loud and boisterous. At the far end of the table sat a man who hadn't said much at all. He ate in silence, His hat pulled low, his dark hair curling at the edges. His movements were steady, deliberate, and when his eyes finally lifted to meet hers, Clara felt a strange jolt. There was something about him, an authority that didn't need words. She quickly looked away, not realizing she had just laid eyes on the landowner himself. The days passed in a blur of work. Breakfast at dawn, dinner at midday, and supper long after the sun dipped behind the mountains. Clara spent hours rolling dough, stirring stews and scrubbing pans, her hands raw from lye soap. The Cowboys, though rough, began to respect her effort. Some teased her gently, asking if she could make pie or if she'd ever seen a real cattle drive. Others offered to chop wood or carry heavy sacks when they saw her struggling. But it was the quiet Cowboy who stood out most. Unlike the others, he never joined in the teasing. Instead, he'd appear silently when she needed help, a steady hand to lift a heavy pot, a wordless gesture to fix the broken hinge on the pantry door. He never asked for thanks, and when she tried to offer it, he simply tipped his hat and walked away. One evening, after a long day of cooking, Clara carried a pot of stew to the dining table. Her arms trembled under the weight, and just as she thought she might drop it, the quiet Cowboy stepped forward, steadying the pot with one strong hand. Their eyes met again. "You don't have to do it all alone," he said softly, his voice low and calm. Clara swallowed hard, surprised by the kindness in his tone. "Thank you," she whispered. He only gave a brief nod before returning to his seat. That night, as Clara scrubbed dishes by lantern light, she found herself thinking about him. Who was he really? He didn't behave like the others, didn't boast, didn't bark orders, yet somehow carried himself with quiet strength. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she sensed he was different. Still, she shook the thought away. She was here to work, to earn her keep, not to get distracted by cowboys. Yet little did Clara know, the man she thought of as just another ranch hand was the very one who owned the ranch, the cattle, and the wide expanse of land beneath the endless sky. And soon, his secret would begin to change everything. Clara soon discovered that ranch life followed its own rhythm, one she had to adjust to quickly. At sunrise, the Cowboys rode out to tend the herds, mend fences, or train horses, while she remained in the kitchen, preparing food that would fuel their long, grueling days. By evening, when the sun dipped low and the sky flared with colors of fire, they would return dusty and exhausted, stomping boots at the door before piling into the mess hall. At first, Clara felt invisible in their world. She was the cook, nothing more, a girl tucked behind pots and pans. But as the weeks went on, her presence became part of the ranch's rhythm too. It began with small things. One cowboy, Luke, praised her biscuits so highly that the others teased him endlessly. Another, Sam, brought her wildflowers from the meadow, leaving them on the windowsill of the kitchen without a word. Laughter started to fill the dining room as she served meals, and Clara found herself smiling more often than she had in years. She didn't realize how much she had missed. Companionship. Simple, honest conversation that wasn't weighed down by pity or judgment. Here the men didn't see her as a poor girl from town. They saw her as someone who kept them fed, someone who worked just as hard as they did. But among them all, her thoughts kept circling back to the quiet Cowboy. Unlike the others, he never sought her attention. He never tried to impress her with tall tales or flirtatious remarks. Yet his presence was steady like the low hum of a song in the background. He worked beside the others but somehow seemed apart, as though he carried a weight none of them could see. Clara began noticing the small ways he helped without making it known. When she was too short to reach the high shelf, she'd find the jar she needed already set down on the counter. When the stovepipe clogged with soot, he was the one who cleaned it out, silently leaving the kitchen warmer than before. One evening, after supper, Clara sat at the long table peeling apples for a pie. The Cowboys had drifted off to their bunks or the barn, but the quiet Cowboy lingered nearby, oiling the leather of his saddle. The kitchen was filled with the soft creak of leather and the gentle scrape of her paring knife. She glanced up, curious. "You don't talk much, do you?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked at her, one brow lifting slightly. Words aren't always needed. Clara paused, the apple in her hand halfway peeled. I suppose not, but sometimes silence can be louder than words. Something flickered in his eyes then, something thoughtful. For a moment she thought he might say more, but instead he only gave her a quiet nod before returning to his work. That brief exchange lingered with Clara long after he left the room. The following week brought a small trial. A delivery wagon carrying supplies got stuck in the mud on its way to the ranch, and Hank ordered the Cowboys to help. Clara, left without ingredients, scrambled to make do with what she had. She managed, a simple stew and biscuits, apologizing when the men sat down to eat. To her surprise, none of them complained. Luke clapped the table. If this is what you call scraping the bottom of the barrel, Miss Clara, then I say we're living like kings. The others laughed, raising their mugs in agreement. But it was the quiet cowboy who caught her eye. He didn't laugh or tease, he simply gave her the smallest of smiles, a look that spoke more than words. For reasons she couldn't explain, that silent approval meant more to her than all the rowdy praise combined. Slowly, Clara realized she wasn't just surviving here. She was finding a place. These men, rough and wild though they were, had accepted her. And though she didn't know it yet, one of them was watching her with a different kind of respect, a quiet admiration that ran deeper than she could have guessed. For Clara, the ranch was becoming more than a job. It was beginning to feel like home. The summer heat settled over the Miller Ranch like a heavy blanket, pressing down on cattle, men, and land alike. Tempers ran short, and work grew harder under the blazing sun. Clara kept the kitchen as cool as she could, though sweat rolled down her back as she bent over the stove. She noticed the Cowboys returned each evening more worn than before, dust clinging to their shirts, voices hoarse from long hours in the fields. One afternoon, as she kneaded bread, Hank burst through the door, his face grim. Storm's coming in fast, he said, jerking his thumb toward the horizon. The herd spooked, breaking toward the river. We'll need all hands to keep them from drowning. The ranch fell into chaos. Cowboys mounted their horses and thundered across the open fields, chasing the panicked cattle as dark clouds boiled above the plains. Clara rushed to the porch, gripping the railing as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and fear. The sky split with lightning. Thunder cracked like cannon fire. From the porch, Clara could see the herd surging, like a black tide toward the swollen river. Men shouted, whips cracked, and hooves pounded the earth. The storm was merciless. She wanted to help, but knew she would only get in the way outside. So she did the one thing she could. She lit every lamp in the kitchen, stoked the fire high, and began to cook. Pots of stew bubbled on the stove, biscuits browned in the oven, and coffee brewed strong enough to chase the storm's chill. Clara worked faster than she ever had, her hands trembling from the roar of thunder and her heart hammering with worry. She imagined the Cowboys soaked to the bone, struggling to keep cattle and horses alive. They would need warmth, food, and strength when they came back. Hours later, long after darkness swallowed the plains, the ranch yard filled with the sound of returning riders. The men were drenched, mud streaking their clothes, faces drawn with exhaustion. Some limped, others leaned heavily on their saddles, but they were alive. The herd, battered but intact, had been driven back from the river. Clara flung open the door. Come inside. There's food, there's coffee, please hurry. The Cowboys stumbled into the kitchen, their voices hoarse but grateful as they collapsed onto benches. She ladled stew into bowls, set hot biscuits on the table, and filled mugs with steaming coffee. The room filled with the smell of food, and slowly color returned to their faces. Luke groaned happily as he tore into his meal. Clara, you're a miracle. I swear you kept us alive tonight. Even Hank, gruff as ever, clapped her shoulder. You've got grit, girl. This ranch needs folks like you. But it was the quiet Cowboy's reaction that struck her deepest. He entered last, water dripping from his hat, shirt plastered to his broad shoulders. His eyes met hers as he crossed the room. He didn't speak at first, just held her gaze, a look of quiet respect that made her breath catch. Finally, he said, His voice low but steady. You saved us more than you know. Food like this after a night like that, it puts strength back in a man's bones. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him she had only done what she could, but the sincerity in his tone left her speechless. Later, when the men had eaten their fill and staggered off to rest, she stayed behind to scrub the dishes. Her hands ached, her body weary, but her spirit felt light. She had faced the storm in her own way, proving to herself as much as to them that she belonged here. As she rinsed the last plate, the quiet cowboy lingered in the doorway. He tipped his hat slightly. You've got more courage than most folks I've ever met, he said softly. Clara looked up, startled. I did what needed to be done. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a faint smile. That's what makes it courage. And with that he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Clara standing in the glow of the lantern, her heart beating strangely fast. For the first time she wondered if perhaps this ranch was not just a place of survival, but a place where her life might truly change. The storm passed, leaving the land washed clean, the grass greener, and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. The ranch slowly returned to its rhythm, though Clara sensed something had shifted. The Cowboys carried themselves differently after the storm, more aware of their own limits, more grateful for the small comforts of a hot meal and a dry bed. For Clara, too, something had changed. That night, standing in the kitchen with the quiet Cowboy's words still echoing in her mind, she felt a spark of pride she hadn't known before. She belonged here. Or at least she was beginning to. But the more she settled in, the more questions she had about the man who always seemed to be there when she needed help. She learned his name at last. Daniel. The others didn't call him much except with a nod or a short word, but Clara noticed something strange. They treated him differently. Not with fear, but with a kind of quiet respect that went beyond friendship. When Hank barked orders, Daniel didn't always obey. In fact, sometimes Hank would glance at him first as though waiting for approval before sending men out. At supper one evening, Luke leaned back in his chair and muttered, "Reckon this place would have gone under long ago if not for him." Clara, ladling stew, frowned. "For Daniel, you mean?" Luke froze for half a second, then shrugged. "Yeah, well, he's got a good head on his shoulders, that one." He shoved a biscuit into his mouth, clearly unwilling to say more. Later that night, when she carried out scraps to the chicken coop, she caught two cowboys talking in hushed tones near the barn. "Don't understand why he don't just say who he is," one grumbled. "Because he don't need to," the other replied. "Man like him doesn't have to shout about it. Folks'll know soon enough." Clara paused in the shadows, her heart thumping. Who were they talking about, and why did the words sound so heavy with meaning? Over the next few days, Clara paid closer attention. Daniel never boasted, never ordered men around, yet they seemed to follow his lead instinctively. When an argument broke out over a broken fence line, Daniel stepped in, speaking only a few calm words, and the fight died instantly. When a new hand nearly caused a stampede, Daniel handled the horse with a skill so sure that even Hank nodded in approval. It puzzled her deeply. If Daniel was just another cowboy, why did he carry himself like someone who owned the very ground he walked on? One afternoon, Clara found herself alone in the kitchen, rolling out pie crusts, when Daniel came in quietly. He placed a small wooden crate on the table. Inside were fresh apples, polished and sweet-smelling. "Thought you might use these," he said simply. Clara blinked in surprise. "Where did you get them? There aren't any orchards for miles." "Planted a few trees by the creek years back," he replied almost casually, as if planting apple trees in the middle of cattle country was nothing at all. "They've done well?" Clara stared at him. You planted them?" Daniel gave the faintest of smiles, his eyes holding hers just long enough to unsettle her. "Some things are worth tending, even if they take years." Then, as always, he tipped his hat and left before she could find words. Her curiosity grew into something restless. Who was this man who planted orchards, calmed storms of men with a single word, and yet sat at the far end of the table like he was no more important than the rest? That night she asked Hank outright, "What's Daniel's story?" Hank's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Best not to go poking your nose where it don't belong, girl. He's a good man, and that's enough for now." Clara bit her tongue, but her mind raced. Secrets were being kept. And somehow Daniel was at the center of them. She lay awake that night, staring at the rafters of her small room. Something told her life was on the edge of changing again, that the ranch she thought she understood was holding truths far bigger than she had ever imagined. And when those truths came to light, she would no longer be able to see Daniel or herself the same way again. The days slipped into late summer, the fields golden and the air sharp with the promise of harvest. Clara had grown used to the rhythm of ranch life, early mornings, endless meals, and the steady hum of work around her. Yet Daniel's quiet presence lingered in her thoughts, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Each time he appeared, handing her a sack of flour she couldn't lift, fixing the leaky pump without being asked, or offering her a simple nod across the supper table. She felt that restless curiosity gnawing at her. Who was he really? She didn't have long to wait for the answer. One Saturday evening, Hank announced that all the hands were to gather in the barn for a meeting. Clara, busy scrubbing pots, thought little of it until Luke poked his head into the kitchen. "You ought to come, Miss Clara," he said with a grin. "This ain't just ranch business, it's something you'll want to hear." Curious, she wiped her hands on her apron and followed him out into the yard. The barn glowed with lantern light. Cowboys clustered in groups, murmuring among themselves. The air crackled with anticipation. At the center stood Hank, arms crossed, his face stern. Beside him, Daniel leaned casually against a post, hat pulled low as usual. Hank cleared his throat. "Boys, you've worked hard this season. You've kept this ranch running through storm and sweat, and I reckon you deserve the truth." He glanced at Daniel. "It's time." Clara frowned, confusion rising as the barn fell into silence. Daniel straightened, removing his hat at last. For the first time, Clara saw his full face in the lantern glow, strong, weathered, and steady, with eyes that carried both kindness and authority. "My name's Daniel Miller," he said, his voice low but clear. "This land, this ranch, it's mine. Been in my family for 3 generations. The words struck Clara like a thunderclap. She froze, staring at him in disbelief. The quiet cowboy, the one who had helped her scrub pots and carry stew. He was the owner of it all? A ripple of surprise moved through the men. Some nodded knowingly, others exchanged stunned glances. Clearly a few had suspected, but the open admission shifted the air in the barn. Daniel continued, his gaze steady. "I've worked alongside you because I don't believe a man earns respect from a title. Respect is earned by sweat, by proving you'll carry the load with everyone else. I never wanted to be the kind of landowner who barked orders from a porch." The Cowboys murmured their approval, some even tipping their hats in quiet respect. Clara's mind spun. Every memory of him, his silence, his subtle authority, his small acts of kindness, fell into place. Of course the men followed. Of course Hank deferred to him. He had been their leader all along, hiding in plain sight. She realized, too, why his every gesture toward her had felt so different. He wasn't just another hand lending her help. He was a man who could command the whole ranch, yet chose to carry buckets and chop wood without complaint. When the meeting ended, Clara slipped out into the cool night, her heart racing. She leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the moonlit fields. She felt both foolish and awed. A moment later, footsteps approached. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. "You're angry," Daniel said quietly, stopping a few feet away. Clara swallowed hard. "Not angry, just surprised. All this time I thought you were—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Just another cowboy," he supplied, a wry smile touching his lips. She met his gaze. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I didn't mean to deceive you. I just wanted to be judged for who I am, not for what I own." Clara looked back at the fields, her chest tight. "You could have told me." "I could have," he admitted. "But I wasn't sure what you'd see in me then, the man or the land. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirp of crickets. Finally, Clara let out a long breath. You're still the man who carried a pot of stew for me when my arms were shaking. That hasn't changed. Daniel's eyes softened. For the first time since she had met him, his guard seemed to lower. That means more than you know. The night air wrapped around them, thick with unspoken words. Clara didn't know what the future held, but one truth had become clear. Her life on this ranch was tied now, in ways she hadn't expected, to the man who owned it all. The night of the reveal lingered in Clara's thoughts for days. Every time she passed Daniel in the yard, every glance exchanged across the supper table felt heavier now, weighted with the truth. She had come to the ranch thinking she was just a cook, a girl barely scraping by. Now she realized she had been working side by side with the man who owned every fence post, every herd of cattle, every acre of grass under the wide sky. Part of her wanted to retreat, to put distance between herself and him. What business did she have? A poor girl from town, with nothing but a carpet bag, standing so close to a man of such standing. But another part of her remembered the way Daniel had carried buckets without complaint, had cleaned the stovepipe, had planted apple trees by the creek. He might own the land, but he had never acted above it. Still, Clara kept her thoughts to herself, throwing her focus into her work. The Cowboys noticed nothing different. Life went on, full of early mornings and long days. But Daniel noticed. She could feel his gaze lingering when she passed, could sense when he was near, even if he said nothing. It wasn't until one quiet evening that the unspoken finally broke. Clara had stayed up late, baking pies for the coming week, the kitchen filled with the warm scent of cinnamon and apples. She was wiping flour from the counter when she heard the creak of boots behind her. Daniel stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his face unreadable. Couldn't sleep, he said softly. Clara gave a faint smile. Neither could I. Work doesn't do itself. He stepped inside, the lamplight casting long shadows. Clara, I owe you more than an explanation. I owe you the truth of who I am, and why I chose to keep it from you. She set down the rag, folding her hands to still their trembling. I'm listening. Daniel leaned against the table, his voice steady but low. I've seen how people change when they know my name. Suddenly they want something from me, money, land, a promise. I wanted to live, even just for a little while, as nothing more than a man among men. And with you, he paused, searching her face. With you, I wanted to know if you'd see me for myself, not for the ranch. Clara's throat tightened. And what if I had known from the beginning? He gave a faint, almost vulnerable smile. Then I'd never have known whether your kindness was meant for me, or for what I own. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft tick of the lantern. Clara's heart ached with the honesty in his words. She realized then that beneath the title of landowner, Daniel carried the same longing she did. The desire to be seen, truly seen, for who he was. Slowly, she reached for the pie cooling on the counter, cutting a slice and placing it in front of him. Well, she said gently, you're still the man who helps fix broken hinges and carries stew when my arms give out. That's the man I've come to know. Daniel's eyes softened, his shoulders easing as though a great weight had lifted. He sat down, taking a bite of the pie, and for the first time Clara saw him smile fully. Not the reserved, quiet smile she'd grown used to, but a smile that warmed his whole face. The days that followed carried a new ease between them. Clara no longer saw him as a mystery to be solved, but as a man whose humility matched his strength. The Cowboys noticed the change too, teasing Daniel when he lingered too long in the kitchen or found excuses to walk Clara to the well. By autumn, the ranch thrived. The herd was strong, the barns full, and the apple trees by the creek heavy with fruit. Clara often found herself standing there, watching the branches sway in the breeze, thinking of Daniel's words. Some things are worth tending even if they take years. One crisp evening, Daniel joined her by the trees, a basket of apples in hand. He looked out across the land, then turned to her. This place, it's not just mine anymore. It feels different with you here. Like home. Clara's chest tightened with emotion. She had spent so long searching for a place where she belonged, never knowing it might be here, in the heart of a ranch owned by a man who valued honesty above all else. As the sun sank low, painting the sky in gold, Daniel reached for her hand. Stay, he said simply. Not just as our cook. Stay as part of this ranch. Part of my life. Clara's heart swelled, and with tears she hadn't expected burning her eyes, she nodded. I'll stay. And with that, the girl who had once wandered with nothing but a carpet bag found not only a home but a future, built on the land she once feared, and with the man who had quietly owned it all along.